Good morning, everyone. In the last video, I shared with you what I was still planting in my Ohio garden in June and promised to share with you some advantages, disadvantages, and tips for successful later season planting. Now, in that video, I was primarily discussing warm season crops, but the tips that I share today are equally useful for getting fall crops established. So here in Ohio and in similar growing regions, to get a fall harvest, we are planting out many of those veggies in July and August, which can be a stressful time for direct sowing or transplanting seedlings. Some of these tips can also be used towards helping reduce stress for older or mature plants, especially during times of increased heat, drought, or insect and disease pressure. So first, what are the advantages to later season planting? The big one for me is convenience. As I mentioned in the last video, sometimes life gets in the way of planting out the garden on time. And the fact that many of our summer or warm season crops can be planted out later, in some cases several months later than that suggested planting time. Here in Ohio, that recommendation is typically like mid-May or directly after that last spring frost. That gives me a lot more grace in terms of when I can get things planted in the garden and still expect to harvest. I used to stress about getting my entire warm season garden in before Memorial Day, but by spreading out those plantings over the course of an entire month, so basically from mid-May to mid-June, sometimes even into late June and July, it's a lot less stressful to deal with the garden. You may find that you actually prefer these late or staggered plantings as they offer another convenience, which is staggered harvests. Rather than putting in all my beans, for example, on May 15th and having an overwhelming harvest in about 2 months, I can stagger smaller plantings over the course of a couple of months, which typically works out to, by the time the first planting has kind of slowed down after 3 or 4 pickings, I have a fresh batch of plants starting to produce. Similar staggered harvest schedules work well for me with crops like cucumbers and summer squash or zucchini, both of which inevitably get knocked back by pests or diseases after about 3 or 4 pickings. A later planting, say around early July, can give me a fresh harvest before my fall frost hits. Now, if you're planting for the sole purpose of canning or preservation and want to get all of that work done in one fell swoop, this may not be the best method for you. It may be easier just to plant everything at the same time and have that harvest coming off it close to the same time. But if you prefer to eat most of your produce fresh or do smaller batches of preservation, this staggered and later planting schedule works really well. You may also find, like I did this season, that being behind and doing these later season plantings actually worked out to my advantage in terms of garden space. Many of my cool season crops were being harvested right about the time I wanted to go in with my warm season crops. So fennel was being harvested, lots of broccoli, the lettuces are all finished, kohlrabi, Chinese cabbage, and a few regular cabbage. And this freed up space to plant things like beans and tomatoes and zucchini and more. Now compare this to if I were trying to get everything in before Memorial Day. None of those cool season crops would have been done yet, so I would have been much more limited on the spaces that I could plant. This is particularly useful if you are limited on garden space. A final advantage is the possibility of avoiding certain specific pests and diseases. For example, one of the pieces of advice that I see commonly given for avoiding cucumber beetles in the garden is to plant a little later in the season. This typically works out to waiting to at least mid-June in many Midwestern regions, or sometime after beetles have laid their first generation of eggs. If the adults can't find any host plants to feed on, chances are they'll move on to greener pastures, i.e. your neighbor's house with a lot of cucumbers that are up and ready for them to eat right now, leaving your late planted cucumbers and other cucurbits alone. Slugs are another pest which I found becomes significantly less problematic as we get later into the season and the days get hotter and drier. We're also able to avoid some of those diseases which favor cool, moist conditions, such as what we typically have in late spring. Now, there are disadvantages or challenges to later season plantings as well, but I found that if we're mindful, there are some relatively easy workarounds to many of these issues. The biggest challenges that I find with later season plantings are the increased heat, the decreased rainfall, and while some specific pest and disease issues become less problematic later in the season, unfortunately, I find that overall pest and disease pressure tends to increase as we get later into the season. The first big challenge is heat. Naturally, the later I wait into the season to plant, the hotter it's going to get. Typically, planting in June in Ohio is a safe bet. Our average June temperatures are in the low 80s. The challenge usually doesn't come until we get into July and August when it gets very, very warm. However, this year, Ohio decided to throw us a curveball, and it's been 90 for the last week with no end in sight. We've also had some very intense sun. It's a rough time to be transplanting out seedlings, even properly hardened off seedlings. Heat like that is very stressful. So I try my best to time out plantings to avoid extreme heat. I'm definitely not planting anything out this week. But when there's just no end in sight to a heat wave and I must plant, I've started taking a couple of extra steps to ensure my seedlings make it. I always, even if we've recently had rain, give my newly transplanted seedlings a healthy drink of water directly after transplanting. I find that shallow, frequent waterings are necessary for newly seeded areas or transplanted seedlings. For direct sown crops, keeping those top couple of inches of soil moist to allow for seed germination is crucial for success. The soil surface, if left exposed, can dry out extremely quickly during hot, sunny days. No moisture can equal no germination, and/or if a very hard crust develops on the soil surface, seedlings may not be able to push through. In addition to frequent watering, I'll typically hand water once every couple of days. Drip irrigation or a sprinkler system can save you a lot of time here. I like to soak seed anywhere from a couple of hours to overnight. This helps me get a jump start on the germination process and ensures that the seeds are able to intake plenty of water, and I cover the plot with a light mulch after sowing. In average weather, I wait to mulch until seedlings are up a couple of inches. But in extreme heat, one of my favorite things to do for larger seeded items, this works well with beans, squash, cucumbers, corn, etc., is to cover the soil surface with an inch or so of rice hulls. These hold water in, but are light enough that seedlings can easily push up through them. Dried grass mulch can work in a similar manner. For smaller seeded items, this works really well with carrots. Covering the newly seeded row with a board after watering can help ensure the seeds and soil stay moist and cool, ensuring proper germination. Just be sure to check under the board each day and remove it as soon as the seeds have sprouted. Just a note that for established plants with well-developed root systems, deep, less frequent waterings are best. When this heat wave started, I made sure to deeply water all of my mature crops and then immediately cover that soil, if I hadn't already, with a thick layer of mulch. If this heat persists and we don't get any rain, I may water my in-ground mature crops again in 2 weeks and my raised bed plantings in 1 week. Now, I mentioned mulching. This is something that I've always done and I talk about extensively in other videos, but it's especially important during times of intense heat because it helps to keep the soil cooler and reduce the rate of moisture evaporation from the soil. I mulch as soon as I'm done transplanting seedlings. Grass clippings are my mulch of choice this time of year, and my preference is actually to use them fresh or shortly after cutting. This way they still have a significant amount of moisture in them, and as they dry down, they form a mat that is really effective at holding soil moisture in and keeping weeds from sprouting up. I also use leaf mulch, hay, and sometimes straw if that's all I can get. Check out this video for more on how I use natural mulches in the garden. Now, in addition to basic watering, I've recently taken to mixing liquid fertilizers or microbial brews into that first watering that my newly transplanted seedlings receive. I found that this really helps give them a little boost during times of stress and helps them get over transplant shock better. I typically just use whatever I have on hand. I've had good luck with AgriGrow and AgriThrive fertilizers, But I've recently been testing out Fox Farms Bush Doctor Microbe Brew as well. In the past, my go-to with fertilizers has just been to add some naturally derived granular fertilizer to the planting hole at transplant time, or to side dress direct sown seedlings after they were up a couple of inches. I still do this, but the last couple of years we've had a bit more stressful growing conditions, and I find that this little extra boost of liquid fertilizer helps get my babies through transplant shock a little easier, as they can more quickly absorb some of these liquids. Applying via a foliar spray is an option for quick absorption as well. Now keep in mind that the nutrients in fertilizers typically need to be dissolved in water so that plant roots can effectively uptake them. And applying fertilizer when the soil is super dry can actually burn plants. This is especially true when using synthetic fertilizers, so just be sure to water when you are fertilizing. I've also taken to almost automatically reaching for the shade netting after transplanting seedlings, typically for at least a week or so after transplanting. I typically use shade cloth in the 30 to 40% range. Even a couple of weeks ago, when the temperatures were still reasonable, in the upper 70s to mid 80s, the sun has been so intense that I'm still getting sunburn on unprotected plants. And these were on seedlings that I had been hardening off for weeks, so they were about as well acclimated as I could possibly get them. I found that using the shade cloth to help transition them helps a lot. During the extreme heat of this week, with some plants, I'm just leaving the shade cloth on full time. For some, I've netted them in such a way that they get morning and a little afternoon sun, but are shaded from 1 or 2 o'clock onward, as I've done with these cucumbers. Here, with this row of peppers, I've done something similar. These get morning and afternoon sun, but have some shade when the sun is at its peak in the middle of the day. These peppers have been in the ground for not quite a month, but a lot of pepper varieties don't handle extreme heat and intense sun super well, and I found that shading them helps. I put shade cloth over this row of melons and squash as soon as I transplanted them. They prefer more light exposure, and with the shade cloth on 24/7, they're not putting on a lot of growth. So I've been slowly transitioning them, taking the shade cloth off in the mornings, putting it back on at about 12 or 1 in the afternoon, and taking it off again in the late afternoon. I also find that shade cloth helps with my direct sown crops. I planted beans here the first day of this heat wave, but by covering the area with shade netting, it helped to keep the ground a little cooler, helps slow moisture evaporation, and helps protect those seedlings when they first emerge. Bonus points for using shade cloth and something like a rice hull mulch. I'll start to wean these off from the shade cloth in a week or so, but for right now they're happy under here. Now you may have noticed the white residue on some of these plants. If I can't net plants easily, or just feel they need some extra protection, I rely on spraying them with Surround Kaolin Clay, which helps not only to keep plants cooler, but can protect from pest and certain diseases as well. So the other challenge I mentioned is increased disease and insect pressure. There are all kinds of various methods for approaching pest and disease control depending on the specific malady that you are dealing with, but as a general rule, I rely heavily on insect netting, such as in the case of flea beetles on eggplant, keeping things like squash bugs, squash vine borer, and cucumber beetles off of my cucurbits, and keeping cabbage worms off of my brassicas. With squash and melon in particular, the nets have to come off when plants start blooming to ensure proper pollination. That's when I start using the Surround I mentioned earlier. Netting has been an absolute game changer in my garden, as it allows me to keep pests from my plants without resorting to sprays. Now, there are all kinds of organic spray options that we can use. The trouble with organic, naturally derived, OMRI approved sprays, especially insecticides, is that depending on what you're using, some of them are still broad spectrum and are going to kill good bugs right alongside the bad bugs. And what I typically see in gardens that use a lot of broad spectrum insecticides is that inevitably the bugs come back. And it's almost always the bad guys that get the upper hand once you've wiped everybody out. Whatever measures we can take to ensure that we have a very biodiverse environment out here, I think is for the ultimate good of the garden and for our own health. So while I will resort to things like spinosad or pyrethrins every once in a while for very targeted problems, I generally try to avoid them. And definitely read those labels, and on a lot of stuff, you're going to want to avoid spraying anything when pollinators are active. So off of that little spiel, but in general, netting has been a game changer in my garden. The trick is to ensure that the netting is very secure to the ground with no gaps where little critters and pests can get underneath. And you also want to make sure that you don't have any big holes or snags in it. For some of my problem crops, this netting goes on as soon as I get seedlings transplanted or as soon as seedlings emerge from the ground. As a general rule, though, the healthier that your plants are, the better developed their root systems, the better able they are to fend off any kind of pest attacks or diseases. This is a big reason for ensuring that your soil quality is top notch and that you are providing proper nutrition and adequate water for your plants at all times. With many of the diseases that I deal with here, especially of tomatoes, prevention is the best cure. So in addition to ensuring that I'm doing everything I can to keep my plants healthy, I've also started using a spray which contains a naturally occurring bacillus bacteria, which helps to boost my plants' own immune systems and may help prevent infections from various fungal and bacterial diseases like blight, anthracnose, leaf spots, and molds by essentially outcompeting the unwanted pathogens. I used it last year as a test on some of my tomatoes, and I was happy with the results. So this year I'll be using it on more of my garden plants. The one I'm using is called Garden Sentinel, and you just mix the concentrate with water and use a sprayer to apply it to plant foliage. This can also be used as a root drench. Whether or not you choose to use a product like this, the key here is really to help reduce the amount of stress on your plants, especially when direct sowing or transplanting later in the season. And again, ensuring that your soil health is on par goes a long way towards achieving this goal. And one last little tip, direct sown plants tend to be hardier right out of the gate. You don't have the whole hardening off transplant shock issues to deal with when plants are direct sown. By their very nature, they tend to be better acclimated to their growing conditions from the minute they emerge from that soil. That being said, even direct sown seedlings, when sown later in the season during times of heat and intense sunlight, may need a little extra TLC. They can still be susceptible to issues like sun scald. So watch those babies closely and consider protecting them with something like shade cloth if you see an issue starting to occur. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What tips do you have for getting plants established later in the season, especially during periods of stress, say increased heat or drought or pest and disease pressure? Drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you found today's video helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.